And let's give Dr. Anderson a good roll tide welcome to the University of Alabama. Good morning, and thanks for inviting me. It's good to be on several years. You may or may not know I was born and raised right down the road in Utah, Alabama, and then I went to Stillman College undergraduate, and so it's good to be back home. I will talk a little bit about how I came to write the book. You probably can help me by grilling me about it, because I leave tomorrow to go to a conference in Decatur, Georgia, which is the History of Education Society. And there's going to be a panel on the book on it, so it's been more than 10 years, and they're going to grill me. And by a group of professional historians, and I know that that's not going to be fun, because if they're like me, you can always find problems with someone else's book. They tell me of all the things that I didn't do, all the things that I did wrong. So, you might as well get me prepared by asking me tough questions to start dealing about it. But anyway, just sort of about the book. Actually, I suppose in some ways it was kind of an accident that I came to write the book, and even to be interested in this field, because when I left Stillman, my major was secondary education, social studies. And I was really planning to become a public school teacher. And I was not certified, or I had not majored in education at Stillman. So part of that was to become certified and go on at the university. And so I did my practice teaching in Chicago, the west side of Chicago, at Marshall High School. And I was going to take a job there, stay there. And I started that in September. Right around Christmas, we got kicked out of the Chicago school system. And the reason we got kicked out is because at the time we were teaching Afro-American history and social studies programs. And we weren't teaching the curriculum. And I'm sure that may sound very old and antiquated to you, but at that time, in public schools, you were not allowed to teach Afro-American history. And if you did, they said you weren't teaching the curriculum. So you got suspended. So I got kicked out. I still had another semester at the university, at fellowship, a 2-year fellowship. I had to else to go, so I went back to Champaign, back to the university. And I completed the courses for my master's program. I was looking for something to take. And I thought that all my life at Stillman and for my first year at the University of Illinois, I'd always taken courses that were required of me, or at least was part of some major. But I had never thought about taking a course that I wanted to take, just for the sake of taking the course. So I decided the way I would do that, would go to the bookstore first, and then walk through the bookstore and look at the books and see what books I'd like to read. And then I signed up for the course. And so I was walking through the bookstore and I saw this one particular course on the history of education, because that was not my major. And the professor was using Malcolm X's autobiography and a number of other books that looked very interesting. And I thought, this would be an interesting course to take. So I signed up for it. His name was David High. He's now a professor of history of education at Stanford University. And we had to do a term paper for that course. And he says, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. And so he says, tell me something about yourself. And I said, well, I'm from Alabama. He said, why don't you take a look at the history of African-American education in the South? I never thought about doing anything like that. I mean, he was something I just took for granted. And so I started reading some books, and I came back with a proposal. And he said, what are you going to write about? I said, I really want to write about how the system failed African-American students. And he says, well, how do you know it failed? I said, well, it did. He says, how do you know it wasn't successful? So what do you mean? He said, well, maybe it did what it was supposed to do. And I thought, what do you mean by that? He says, maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe the system did what it was supposed to do. Maybe it was a success. Maybe it was not a failure. And I went back and rethought it, and I thought, that may be a good question. And so what was the purpose of education for African-American students in the state of Alabama, in the South, in other places, as defined by state governments and local districts and others who control the system? And I got started with that term paper. Well, I only scratched the surface. I mean, the only thing that term paper taught me was how much I did know. It's like I knew 1/10 of 1%, and there was a world of knowledge out there. But it was the first time that I really had a passion for something. I mean, I've done a lot of stuff, but it was always like, I got to do this paper, and it's Saturday night, it was due on Monday. And somehow I got to come through with it. So I would do it. And I got to study for this exam, and I would do it. But it was nothing that I really ever wanted to do myself. And for the first time, there were questions that I wanted to find an answer to, not for someone else, but for myself. I wanted to know the answers. And so I really couldn't get enough of trying to find the answers to these questions and to piece this puzzle together. And so finally he says, well, it may be a topic for a dissertation, if you're that interested. And I ended up writing the dissertation. But even after writing the dissertation, I only realized that there's just a world of knowledge out there that I don't know. And I started to publish the dissertation. In fact, when I finished it, I sent it out to different presses, and some people said, well, it sounds a lot like a dissertation, with a little bit of work you can get it published. And I thought, well, there's so much more that I don't know. So I started to work on it. And then, at some point, I actually decided to quit and not do it. And I remember going in and talking to my department head, and he says, how is the book coming? I said, well, I'm kind of tired of it. I said, plus everybody knows that stuff. And he says, wait a minute. He says, this is your first book. And he says, I've written books before, and this is a natural state of development. He said, you get to a point where, because you've been studying the subject so long, and you've been on so many things so many times, you think the world knows. You're the only person that knows this stuff. No one else has a clue as to what you're doing. And he says, it's still a worthwhile book. And actually, at that point, I had just about decided not to do it. And he says, I was there once where I thought, why am I doing this? Everybody knows this stuff. That's just because you keep studying. So he says, go ahead with it. And so then I went and decided, okay, I'll give it one more shot. And I went ahead and completed it. And it was interesting because there was an editor who was at the University of North Carolina who had been publishing this book. He had talked to me about 3 years ago at a history conference. What are you doing? I said, I'm working on history, Afro-American education in the South. He said, well, when you're done, can I take a look at it? I said, yeah. Because at that time I was thinking, why not? Yeah, you take a look at it. And I had just finished all but the last chapter, and I was getting ready to work on the last chapter, and the phone rang. And he says, how are you coming with the book? And it had been 3 years, I hadn't heard from him. And I thought, you didn't forget about it? He says, no. I said, well, actually I'm at a state where I've done 5 chapters, I got 1 chapter to do. He said, well, send it to me. So I don't promise you that we'll publish it, we'll give you a quick turnaround, we'll let you know. And I thought, this is really, really interesting. And so I sent it to him, and then he got right back with me and says, we want to publish it. And I finished the last chapter. So now I have an incentive. And one of the things, I made a huge mistake. And probably reading the book, you don't, I'm not, when you write a book, only you know the mistakes you make. And even when people are very critical of you, you're saying, that's okay, but you knew what I knew. You were really slamming it. But at Fisk University, they have the most wonderful collection of pictures of African-American schools you've ever seen in your life. I mean, they must have something like 10,000 pictures in there. All those pictures in that book are from from the Fisk University collection. And I've been there time and time again. I've been watching those pictures again and again. And I'm like, I got something to do. I got to find this. I got to find that. These pictures are interesting. And I wasn't thinking about the fact that you need pictures for your book. And so when I finally completed it, he says, well, what about the pictures? Like, So that was the first mistake. The second mistake I made was I went back to the university to get pictures, but guess what I did do? I didn't take the manuscript with me. So I'm sitting there trying to figure out what pictures go with what story. I knew the story very well. And all these different county training schools and Rosenwald schools and other kind of schools and so on. I'm trying to do that. And I thought, if I had this manuscript here with me at this time, I could go through it and just put the pictures with it and tell kind of a pictorial story all by itself. Okay, this is the second mistake. And if I keep making mistakes like this, this book is going to go right down the hill. And the one thing I did find, though, which I'm kind of sentimental about, is that I found a school in the very back of the book, which is the school that my mother went to in Utah, Alabama, which was one of those little Rosenwald schools. And I found that, which she never knew I found it, and then when I showed it to her, she was really, I had not told her that I was writing the book, but a friend of mine told her that I was doing this. And finally she called, she says, someone told me that you was writing a book. I said, yeah, I'm writing a book. So she says, well, how many pages? I knew what she was thinking. Is he really writing a book, or is this like a 10-page? So she said, well, how many pages? I said, well, I think it's going to be around 300-some pages. like silence. Oh, okay. And so she was kind of in awe of this whole notion. But then when I finally took the book home to her, and then turned to that picture where she went to school, and then she says, "You should have talked to me before you wrote this book. I could have told you a lot of stories." And at first you go from being in awe, and now you tell me that I should have come to you for instruction. But then moms do that, right? At some point you always become the child again, even when you write a book. So, but anyway, that's how I came to write it. And I reflect on it and realize that in some ways it was in part accidental. Something just sort of guided me toward doing this. I had never made plans to do this. It wasn't though that it was an aspiration I set out to even be in this field. And particularly I did not set out to write this book, but things just kept moving me in this direction. And there were times when I almost gave up on it. I thought that, well, I don't know if this is really worth continuing, and I'm not sure whether, in the end it's going to all be worth the effort. And people around me kept saying, no, I think it's important that you do. And I realized from that you do have to have not only a passion for what you do, but you have to believe that it is worthwhile and that you will get something out of it. Otherwise, I mean, it's so easy to give up because it is a lot of hard work and effort. And so fortunately, I did have people to say, this is something that we need to read about and learn about, so keep doing it. And finally, I completed it, and that's sort of the story in a nutshell.
I'll fire a couple. In terms of the grain against which it was written, I know of Henry Allen Bullock's work out of the 1960s, published at Harvard University Press, this magisterial effort to talk about the history of black education in the whole of the United States, going back to the 1600s coming forward. And in terms of single monographic work oriented against that, I'm sure Dr. Woodson has done something along some lines, but what can you tell us in terms of sort of the tradition of historical writing on the topic, what else was out there, and where this fits within it?
And that was part of the motivation, because it was written in part because, and that was one of the problems I was facing, because people were telling me that, you want to write a dissertation on this subject, but people have already written on it. In fact, Henry Bullock's book, A History of Education in the South, won the Bancroft Award. And so it was not only the book, it was the award-winning book. And then there was another one that was very important to me by Lewis Holland, called Separate and Unequal. That was also about history of segregation and inequality in Afro-American education in the southern region. And so those two books were books that I had read and studied as graduate student, but I didn't agree with it. I kept thinking that, there's an important part, an important dimension that's missing here. And I remember, and I'm very grateful to Bullock. He's pious since then, but my first job interview was at the University of Texas, Austin, and he was director of the Black Studies program in the College of Education at that time. And I went to give a presentation, and I was a bit nervous because I was actually arguing against his own interpretation of the origins and the development of African-American education in the South. And I was going, and of course I have a lot of respect for him, and as you know, when you're born and raised in Alabama, someone that's much older, you're taught to have respect, a lot of respect. And I remember as a child, you could pass someone sitting on the porch and you said hello, and you went to the store and you came back, and you gonna say hello again. Your mother was like, did you see this so-and-so sitting on the porch? I said hello when I found you. And you say hello when you come back. So you just taught to have this respect. So I was going in to meet him, and I had respect for him as a scholar, but also all he accomplished. And I knew he was one of those pioneers. And so I gave this presentation. I was sort of juxtaposing my own work against his and Lewis Holland and others. And so afterwards, he says, he says, I think you're right. He said, you should keep doing what you're doing. He said, I think you're right. I was actually surprised by that, because he had this great book out, and he was arguing against it. And he says, when I wrote this book, and something about this book, which I didn't know, he says, my field is sociology of education. He says, I've written a lot of things in sociology of education, my best work. And he says, I got no notoriety for that. And he says, at one point I decided to write this book, and he said, I was playing with these ideas. They're really Hegelian ideas about really the unintended consequences of history. And what he was arguing, that people intended to do one thing, but there was this byproduct, and the byproduct was more important in terms of its impact on African Americans than what was actually intended. Well, my argument was quite the opposite, that what was intended was more important than the byproduct. And he said, I was really playing with these ideas, and I ended up writing this book. And he said, I had no idea that he was going to win the Bancroft Award, and no idea that this book would bring me more notoriety than anything else I had ever done. And he says, I'm fortunate for that. And he says, I like what I've done. But he encouraged me to take my own path. And that doesn't happen often. Particularly in our field. You meet people who treat this thing like it's a cult. And you should follow them and follow them religiously. And there he was saying, follow your own path. And he really wanted me to come to the University of Texas Austin and replace him in that position. As he's getting ready to retire. I decided instead to go to Indiana University. But it was his book and Lewis Holland that was on the other side. And I had thought that they did not really appreciate the extent to which the systems of education designed for African Americans in the South were designed to keep them subordinate. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a byproduct. That people had literally thought through a whole system of education. And that they were actually trying to educate them to assume subordinate roles throughout the whole region. And so we should really look upon the system as a state-sponsored system of subordination. That's the way it should be viewed. Well, they were, Lewis Holland was saying, well, politics was like that, and economics was like that, but education was intended to salvage inequality. And so, I don't think it was. I think it was intended to be a part of that oppression, not to counter as a way in which he was arguing. And I was arguing the same thing with that. And I've met Holland, who's still teaching at the University of Maryland, and people like that. And it's been good to meet all those people who were out there when I was a graduate student. But I remember Bullock the most because he had a lot to do with my continued success in the sense that he gave me this picture and said, young man, keep doing what you're doing. Another second question?
Yes, I'll keep some more going until I see some hands going up. We had discussions of the concept of hegemony, and we have, and even as I think about Dr. Bullock's work, in his introduction, he reflects on the influence of the concept of the dialectic, the dialectical method, and particularly, he doesn't reference so much Hegel or Marx, but instead a 16th century European writer, Giacomo Vico, and his comments on the dialectical method, which he actually relates to studies of things from ancient Egypt, as I remember reading by Vico. But nonetheless, he, I'm sure, recognized the dialectical method's relationship to thinkers like Hegel and Marx, and then you bring in the concept of hegemony, which has its connections to an Italian communist deeply influenced by Karl Marx, Antonio Gramsci. Could you comment in terms of where some of these larger ideas of social structure, of political processes was something that you wrestled with in developing your analysis of education?
Yeah, so to me that was always an interesting encounter because some people have these, I call it interpretive schemes to try to explain what happened, and I'm always interested in that, but for me individually as a scholar, I have to figure out how things work and to be able to bring them down to a fairly plain explanation. I mean, I have to be able to go from something that's very plain to something that's very sort of complex and abstract. But I have to be able to go back and forth. I just can't remain at the abstract level. And I think that's in Utah. I mean, at some point I have to have my feet on the ground and possibly some mud between my toes in order to feel comfortable. and it's difficult to stay up there just in terms of the schema. And so I was always trying to look at issues of contradictions in society. But to me, you know, if I could work those contradictions out in terms of looking at the viewpoints of African Americans in these places, in local districts, in school settings, as principals and educators, as community people, as farmers, and looking at their aspirations and what they wanted for their children, and the ways in which they fought and struggled against fairly oppressive schemes by the state, then contradictions made sense to me. The contradiction was that between those kinds of efforts on the one hand, and efforts by the state on the other hand do the exact opposite. Hegemony made sense to me in the sense that if people are trying to convince the opposition that their way is the best way, and that the way they think of the world, and the way they think of your place in it is in fact the best way, and the extent to which you believe them or not believe them, then all of a sudden notions of hegemony make sense to me. Just in terms of how Gramsci or how other theorists sort of abstractly laid those out, that was not enough. I had to see that operationalized. I had to see that at work in everyday life and people relating to each other. And so I could see people going to African American educators or working with Booker T. Washington, working with others, trying to convince them that, look, this is the way that African Americans should be educated. And they're trying to convince them of that because in their minds it creates the best of all possible world, the kind of world that they want to live in. But then I can see African Americans saying, well, no, that's not the kind of world we want to live in. And we don't want to educate our children for that kind of world. We have a different world in mind, and we have a different kind of education because we need a different kind of education in order to realize the world that we want to live in. And that kind of opposition, and that kind of conflict makes sense. And so then I can take those theories, which are very useful, and they serve as a guide to help me understand, how those conflicts and contradictions work themselves out. What was the source of the conflict in the first place? Why were you arguing about it? What was it all about? So in that sense, they were very important to me. Some historians seem to be much more interested in the theoretical debates. I was much more interested in using that for an understanding of what happened and how it happened, why it happened, and to look at it in a very concrete